Hi everyone, welcome to our Revitalizing Cultural Burning discussion. My name is Brendan Mercer and I'm a Forest Fuel Management Liaison for First Nations Emergency Services Society, and here is my co-host.
Hey everybody, my name is Quentin Nelson. I too work for Finesse as a Forest Fuel Management Liaison, and I'm a forester in training.
We have an excellent presentation for you guys today, and here are some of the topics we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail. So we're going to introduce you to the idea of First Nations firekeepers and their role in history. Then we're going to talk about some of the historical limitations with a focus on the impacts of the historical limitations to forestry, to water bodies. Then we're going to get into some of the desired effects of cultural burning with specific focus on animals, plants, and communities. So Quentin, why don't you tell them about cultural burning and fire?
Thanks, Brendan. So, to start, a little bit about cultural burning and fire. As you can see, fire has been a harmonious and historic tool that has nurtured the tight-knit relationship between Indigenous people and their lands. Traditional firekeepers tend to sacred fire in a manner specific to the religious traditions of that culture. So, now we're going to take a look at the photo and dive in a bit. So, as you can see, this is Annie Kruger. She's a former Okanagan elder and traditional firekeeper for Penticton Indian Band. Before she passed away, she was a firekeeper, as were the generations before her in the Okanagan region. It was her job to use the flames to purify the land by setting fire to berry bushes, hillsides, and even mountains to renew growth and clear brush to create natural fire guards. In general, elders and firekeepers are capable of meeting cultural objectives via burning activities on the land base. So now we're going to talk about a little bit of historical limitations. So in 1874, BC became the first province to ban cultural burns with the Bushfire Act. This had intentions of removing ceremony and assimilating Indigenous peoples. The result of this caused the Indigenous mindset shift from seeing fire as good to seeing it as bad. This is because the burning ban turned many Indigenous people towards fire suppression in the 1960s and the 1970s, thus teaching children about becoming firefighters rather than firekeepers. A little bit about fire suppression. So originally, fire suppression was implemented to protect watersheds and timber values. According to the report of the Superintendent of Forestry that was created in 1911, those who were caught burning were subject to a $100 fine, which is equal to $2,200 today. Further echoing the message of no fire, fire prevention campaigns began in the 1930s, which discouraged any use of fire in the forest. Colonial fire management practices and regulatory authorities greatly limited the frequency, extent, and magnitude of traditional burning practices.
Alright, so we're going to take a look at 80 years of fire suppression in a forest and some of the impacts that happened. So we're going to take a look at a quote from Hoishan elder Albert Joseph. Essentially, he said, "The brush in them days never got as thick as it does now, especially in the gullies. Some gullies have vegetation as tall as this building now." And over the next couple of pictures, you'll be able to see this firsthand, exactly what he's talking about. But I just wanted to give you a little bit background on this particular stand. There's a Ponderosa Pine stand that occurs just south of the border, so not too far away from where we are here locally. But more importantly, they're able to do some historical research, and they were able to show that every 3 to 30 years there is a historical fire return interval in this ecosystem. So now you'll see what 80 years of fire suppression can do to an ecosystem when it doesn't have that regular fire return interval. So you see here the yellow arrows coming in, so we want to focus on these two trees as we go through the next couple of pictures to give you a better idea what exactly Albert Joseph is talking about. So here in 1948 you can see there's some new recruitment of juvenile stems in that particular stand. 1958, you can see a couple more trees in the background coming through. And then we look at the 1960s. Couple more trees in the background, so as you can see it's slowly starting to build up this ecosystem, getting more and more forest fuels in there. In 1979 it's getting a lot denser. Those trees that have arrows are getting to be a lot harder to see. And then in 1989 you can almost not even see the trees anymore. just going to show how much vegetation can come back over the course of time just through fire suppression alone. But then when we look at these same impacts on a landscape level, it gives us a little bit different perspective. As a Skeeterson elder once told us, named Joe Gilchrist, the fire gives birds a chance to get in there and eat the wood ticks. After a fire, rattlesnakes have less of a chance to hide, so they tend to stay away a little bit more. And you can see how this applies at a landscape level, because the picture in the top from 1934 shows an open hillside. There's not a lot of vegetation there. You can have really good sight lines and see. But in the bottom picture in 2010, it's looking at the same bank. There's a whole heck of a lot more trees in that particular stand now. And that's basically because of the previous slide, it shows recoupment happens over time and fills in those gaps with new trees. So the same can be seen with this different picture from a different angle here. The left bank being almost barren of vegetation, and then the lower 2010 picture being almost entirely covered in trees. So having all this extra vegetation on the landscape can detrimentally impact water, which is very important to First Nations communities. As a Silex elder, Mary Louie, once said, "Water is Mother Earth's blood," because water can provide the necessary physical, mental, and spiritual nourishment to our children. So we need to keep water sources clean. And again, this is very important for First Nations because there's a big historical impact and spirituality involved with water. In particular, a lot of oral histories began at a time when the earth was primarily covered by water. So it just goes to show that since time immemorial, water has been so critical to First Nations communities. But getting into the impacts of severe wildfire, essentially if you have a severe wildfire, it can impact the riparian area around water bodies. Therefore, this impacts the light inputs, nutrient inputs, water flow, extent, timing, and many different impacts can happen from that. Essentially, if this happens, you can get a lot more nutrients running off into the river system, and in some cases even 5 to 60 times more nitrogen or phosphorus can be found downstream from a wildfire. And having that much more nutrients in that type of concentration can be very detrimental to water bodies, and especially invertebrates. Small river invertebrates that live within these water bodies can be very poorly impacted from things like this.
All right, so a little bit about some culturally desired effects. So to start off, we got a quote from Etlakatlan elder, Millie Mitchell, saying, "People used to go out to get their own clothing in the mountains by gathering bark, roots, and mosses. All the clothing, right down to your feet, were gathered and hunted for." Many First Nations communities place a high importance on drought-tolerant, fire-adapted species that may be considered fuels, but often are used for wildlife habitat, food, medicine, and fibrous material for making things. So some common interview themes that we see and hear from all bands is increased berry production, such as raspberries, blackberries, huckleberries, and saskatoons, deer range improvements, improved community protection, pest management such as ticks and mosquitoes, hunting improvements, forest sustainability, and medicinal plant production. Speaking of significant plants, so again, we're going to start off with a quote from a Etlakatlan elder, Hilda Austin. "In the olden days, there were hardly any bushes or trees. The people burned so the huckleberries can grow and the blackcaps can grow." So here you can see a list of significant plants, and they're listed by their common name, their traditional name, and their Latin name. And these plants have medicinal and nutritional properties that are found in the Etlakatlan territory. Here you can see some significant plants that are found in the Secwepemc territory. So to start off with a quote from Mary Thomas, Secwepemc elder, "A lot of people couldn't believe that our people deliberately burned the mountainside. When it got so thick, nothing else would grow in it." So here you can see a list of some examples of significant plants in the territory, and they're listed by their common name, traditional name, and Latin names, and they all have medicinal and nutritional properties found in the territory.
Alright, when we're looking at the benefits to plants, essentially this picture here was taken shortly after one of our prescribed burn projects in one of the First Nations communities we represent. So it just goes to show some of the plants that come back fairly quickly. In this particular case, arrowleaf balsam root, pine grass, and yarrow were some of the species that came back quickly. And species can come back quickly after burn, depending on the severity of the burn itself. So as I mentioned previously, really severe burns can actually make soils become hydrophobic, which actually repels water. And when that happens, the soil becomes a lot more erodible and can end up in different water bodies and displaced across the landscape. However, if you keep prescribed fires to a lower intensity level, they can be super beneficial in terms of producing good berry growing conditions, enhancing medicinal plant growth, and on top of many, many other significant benefits that can happen. And one that doesn't get maybe mentioned enough is some studies have actually shown that mycorrhizal fungi can benefit from low intensity prescribed fires as well. So it just goes to show that having these low intensity prescribed fires actually brings a lot of benefit to some of these plant communities.
Alright, so some benefits to communities. So this can be seen through the reduction of insect pests and invasive plants. It can also be seen through risk reduction activities via the removal of a fuel buildup and the creation of natural fire guards, as well as facilitated travel for people. So activities involved in indigenous land management, such as cultural burning, are seen to enhance well-being as well as improve physical and mental health. So cultural burning empowers people, strengthens their sense of identity, and gives the ability to foster important relationships with members of their community. In addition, it provides access to traditional foods and promotes physical activity. A few other additional cultural burning benefits can be seen in the form of, and we elaborated a little bit earlier, hunting. So in some cases, First Nations burned areas for hunting elk, bison, deer, and alligators. Smoke was sometimes used to dislodge animals from tree cavities as well. There's crop management. So in many cases, burning was used to improve yields of raspberries, strawberries, huckleberries, and it can also facilitate the gathering of acorns. We can see fireproofing, so protecting the communities in special areas from wildfire by pre-burning, and improving travel corridors, so clear travel corridors for safety and improved visibility.
Alright, lastly we're going to talk about some of the benefits to animals. So to give you a quote from Chief Ron Ignace from Skeechason, my great-grandfather used to go out and strategically, tactically burn certain areas so we could enrich the fruits and berries of the area and enrich the grasses so the game could have better feed and ensure a biodiverse forest. So after the 2017 wildfire in Ashcroft, a study began on moose populations to determine how they would respond to that wildfire. Unfortunately, the data is a little bit too new to share with you, but there was a very similar study that came out of the United States where they were able to use a plane and fly over different study plots for about 5 years, and they compared the total amount of moose population in different areas, so the control area, forested area, a burnt area, etc. And because of that, they were able to say that there were definitively more moose in these burnt areas because of the successional species that were coming back post-disturbance. It's actually very, very beneficial throughout the moose life cycle to have those sort of species, especially in the late fall, to eat on.
So in conclusion, cultural burns were designed to enhance both ecological and cultural values, as well as maintain open forest conditions, improve wildlife habitat, and encourage the growth of important plant species. Burns were also viewed as a way to cleanse and give back to the land. Due to the historic challenges around Indigenous burning practices, Finesse is actively working with the BC Wildfire Service and other partners such as Indigenous Services Canada to re-engage and revitalize cultural burning. For other resources that go over cultural burning, you can visit the podcast called Good Fire, which is intentionally lit fire with an ecological or cultural goal in mind. This podcast is hosted by Dr. Amy Cardinal Christensen, where she examines a different aspect of good fire in each episode.
And of course, if you're interested in learning more about the projects that we specifically do at Finesse, feel free to check out our Facebook, our YouTube, or even our website at www.finesse.bc.ca. Thank you everybody for sitting through our presentation, and we certainly hope you learned a thing or two today.
Thank you.